Please take it away.
Great. Thank you very much for the incredibly warm welcome, full of many words that exemplify size of your gratitude. You're welcome. I'm happy to be here today. Unfortunately, I don't know how much I'm going to tell you about creating ethical agreements. As you'll see, I have more questions, I think, than I do answers, but hopefully we can do some thinking together, which is often what I think good philosophy does. What's the plan for the day, for the talk, I should say? First, just have an open question about the role of agreement. I have some thoughts, but nothing completely settled. I want to take a quick look at the basic components of agreement first. If we aren't aware of what we're talking about in terms of agreement, it's tough to think about the ethics involved. We'll complicate some of those basic components to get beyond it and show immediately how things can get messy by looking partially at deep agreements as well, what they are, and I think the prominent role that they play when thinking about ethics and agreements. Finally, we'll get to ethics, and then we'll complicate ethics as well, take it to a couple of different avenues and perspectives and degrees of complexity before concluding. So, as mentioned, I plan on providing some thoughts on these topics, some assertions, but everything is I'm always willing to be rationally persuaded, as I might say. So you'll see that the main purpose here for me is just to highlight questions, but I also think doing the work to figure out the questions that we should be addressing is as important as answering the questions. So during the discussion, please let me know if you think I'm asking the wrong ones or if these are some of the right questions to keep pursuing research in this area. Okay, the role of agreement. So where does agreement kind of arise in the realm of argumentation? I think the first place that seems to be most obvious for people is as a potential end. One of the goals you might want to reach through a process of argumentation. And I do think indeed that is one role, but I agree with the view that they expose in normative pragmatics, that really the end of argumentation depends on the context and the arguer. So I don't by any means think that it's an overarching goal or it has to be the main goal, but I do think it is one plausible goal. And I think we can find it perhaps in some of the main theories that we already have. So some of the common ends that are articulated for argumentation to resolve a difference of opinion on the merits from the pragmadialectical perspective, to gain the adherence of the audience to a thesis or to persuade, perhaps from a rhetorical perspective, or to find the truth of the matter or the best supported conclusion, perhaps from an epistemological perspective. So one of the things that I'm curious about is if any of them so far, or all of them, have highlighted a role for agreement, one that centers it as a main focus, because that gives us some starting grounds. Unfortunately, I don't think it seems, at least for the pragmadialectical perspective, that agreement plays a central role. As they say, it should be borne in mind that the primary aim of a critical discussion is not to maximize agreement, but to test contested standpoints as critically as possible by means of a systematic critical discussion of whether or not they are tenable. In a footnote, they say you might think of it as reverse utilitarianism, something to find kind of the least harmful um, sort of a resolution or an agreement. It does seem to be a lot more central in the rhetorical perspective, which says explicitly when you're attempting to gain the adherence of an audience to a thesis, that adherence registers the degree of agreement or assent to a thesis. So we can see here agreement is central in the rhetorical perspective, and one of the main aims. Of course, there's a lot of caveats around it, but it is central. From the epistemological view, so far I haven't seen a whole lot about agreement directly. It's my newer area of investigation, though, so I might have just missed it thus far. Let me know if you know a prominent quote about it or place where it's written. But from what I can tell, truth doesn't really care if you agree with it, if that's what we're after. But ideally, of course, we would want to agree with the truth. So it's there, but as a kind of a secondary, I think, consideration. So the last people I asked, of course, are my students because I have the most common access to them, and they all, well, 90-something% when I did it on a Mentimeter in the classroom, had expressed that agreement was a core component for resolving disagreements through verbal or rational or discussion means in their lived experience as well. So they don't really feel like resolving a difference of opinion just means walking away, continuing to disagree, but ideally reaching some sort of an agreement. So it is in argumentation of course, right? And even if in the pragmadialectical view it's not to maximize agreement, they don't say that there's no aim to reach it. So it's sprinkled throughout in different ways, sometimes more or less prominently, right? But if we want an agreement, right, if that is something that is an end, at least in some cases, what exactly is it? There's a quote somewhere, I can't find it, but I think it's from Wittgenstein, who was talking about a concept that he says, it seems pretty obvious, but then as soon as you try to get a grip on it, you find that it kind of slips through your fingers. And this is exactly how I felt when I started thinking about what agreements are. So one view might hold that an agreement is just an absence of disagreement, right? I know, again, on the pragmadialectical view, critical discussion only happens when there is doubt or disagreement. And I think they even say explicitly, if doubt or disagreement isn't there, then you have agreement. I don't think that that's the case. I think you can have an absence of disagreement, maybe because you just don't realize there's something that should be there. It could be ignorance. You could just be indifferent to a matter as well. I think there's a lot of middle ground between disagreement and agreement. And so agreement is something that is positive and that should have a positive definition as well, or a positive characterization. I don't think we could just use it as the negative absence of disagreement. Because I work in a law and business department, of course, my colleagues almost immediately said, "Oh, I know what an agreement is. It's a contract." But I don't think an agreement is a contract either. And some of my more philosophically inclined legal colleagues also agree. And you might think of a contract as the signing of a document or the acknowledgement of some of the outward expressions or representations of some components of some agreements. But there is a well-known problem in law about the problem of incomplete contracts and incomplete agreements. So they recognize right away that a contract or a document would never really constitute an ideally complete agreement by any means, and that it's got some limitations. So the contract itself may be a representation, but I'm not sure if it would really get to the heart of what an agreement is. So what's a rough characterization that I landed on? Kind of the perception of, right, or the recognition of the coalescing of attitudes towards some proposition or non-propositional, usually cognitive content, right? Which is a pretty fancy way of saying that I recognize that you and I recognize that we agree on something, right? So it seems to be a little bit more accurate in the communicative context, at least. And in terms of a contract, this is the recognition that would precede the writing and then the expression of it, right? To have that overlap in those attitudes that would lead to, say, the construction of a document that expresses that kind of an agreement. So I'm trying to get down to the base about what an agreement actually is. And this is roughly how I kind of came to this thinking. So if we're talking about the coalescing of attitudes toward content, right, we can ask ourselves immediately, of course, well, what kind of content? What are some of the things that we could agree about, we could agree on, etc. This led to me trying to determine what are the basic components of agreement, which of course involves some research, but it also involved just a lot of reflection. And I'm hoping if it is incomplete, you can help me fill it in, right? But one of the first things I recognize is that agreement is almost always like a bilateral or to somebody. It's never usually alone. To agree with oneself seems like an odd statement to me. So we do always agree with, right? We agree with either other identifiable people. We might agree with a specific claim, right? But we also agree with people in positions kind of broadly, which I'm going to get into later, and that complicates the situation quite a lot. So we might have certain political agreements. We agree with this theory or this economic theory. We agree with certain religious frameworks or propositions, right, individually. So there's always a target of agreement, I guess is another way to say it, right? So there's always the agreement with, and then I think at base, we also always agree that or to, right? Which is sometimes part of that with this clear claim to, or with the clear claim that, right? We could agree. But propositionally, I think this is where we're at its base. And this maps the theoretical and the practical distinction in the reasoning and argumentation literature. When we think about studying those two types of reasoning, if we get to the conclusions of those two things, those are the conclusions that we could agree with, right? We'd either agree that or to. Kind of a level up. We also can agree because it doesn't always have to be explicit or well known or anything like that. And it's usually, I think it's always attached to a that or a to as well. So in other words, we might agree that I'm going to go to a cottage this weekend because I need a break, right? Or I'm going to go to a cottage this weekend because somebody's coming to clean my house. I don't know, right? But you might have differing reasons for the conclusion that you're agreeing to, which is, I think, a familiar distinction that we all here are aware of, right? So the reasons for our conclusions. But we can also, I think, somewhat distinctly agree so, which is a kind of a pragmatic agreement, right? So you might agree to pay a fine, so you can just drop the issue, right? There is some overlap between these things. I don't want to say they're completely mutually exclusive, but for the most part, I think they're pretty distinct. But agreeing so is kind of its own reason. If somebody says, why did you agree with that? You might give them a so reason that is not a motivating reason or a normative reason in the because or the that sense. Right? So these are, I think, the basic kind of types of agreement that we can have. Any other type that I've heard of so far boils down to one of these. I had a colleague ask, well, what about agreeing on? What if we agree on something? That for me just boils down to agreeing that something is the case or to do something, right? We agree on this course of action or we agree on the claim that, right? So that one's not something that I consider a new development, but again, these were for me just essentially on reflection. So I couldn't think of other distinct types that don't boil down to these, but if you have any, I would love to hear about them now or in an email, whenever you're ready. So if those are some of the content, how do we know if an agreement has happened or is around, right? What makes it maybe stronger or weaker? Is there a threshold for when agreement is and is not? I don't have a clear definitive line, but one option that I first kind of thought of is we have an agreement if we have an overlap in the type, right? So if we share that coalescence on one of the withs, that's, tos, so's, becauses, right? If we share an overlap on one of those, then we have an agreement, right? So my wife and I might agree that we should go to Italy, right? We know we have that agreement. It's both there. There's the content. We agree on the two, right? But now we have another level. Perhaps we both agree because it would also be nice to see her parents, right? But I might say, oh, I want to go because they have nice beaches. So if we agree on one thing in the equation, one kind of part of content, the two, but we don't agree on the because, to what extent do we actually have an agreement? I think is an important question. So do we just need the agree to, or do we need both the to and the because, right? How many types of overlap? If you're lacking some overlap in the realm of the discussion and the agreement, is it still safe to say that you have one? And how does it change if you don't? So in the paper I have that was linked in the abstract for this talk on the basic components of agreement, this is kind of the approach I take that I realized was a bit problematic a bit later. So the other approach, right? And I wrote this in the follow-up paper. What about the depth of conviction, right? When I think about the agreements that I have in my real world, I'm not usually thinking about how many types of agreement do I have that overlap with somebody, but rather how strongly am I feeling the agreement between us? And so this led me to think a little bit more about depth of conviction. So I immediately wondered if we have differing depths of conviction, do we still agree or disagree? Right. So if I 100% want to go to Italy and my wife only 80% wants to go to Italy, right? Do we still, but we both agree to go, do we still have an agreement, right? Or similarly, we both agree 100% to, but we have the differing convictions on the because. I'm 50% because of her parents, 50% because of the beach, right? Do we still have an overall agreement in that regard, right? So some differing scenarios. If you have 100% agreement, a conviction on a that or a to, right? Essentially, that would mean you could never be persuaded, right? So one of the examples I have is maybe if you have 100% agreement with a friend to do the same thing every year for your birthday. No matter what happens, neither of you can be persuaded to do something else. You have that agreement together. It's 100% conviction, right? So I think that seems to be a clear case, right? But you could have, say, 80 and 55% conviction on a because, right? As I mentioned already about perhaps a trip, right? Is that still an agreement? I'm not sure, right? You'll see a lot of question marks here. These are all things I'm thinking about still and working on, right? If you had 100% conviction on all items, would it make you the same person, right? Which we're going to talk about again, I think a little bit towards the end. What would it mean to actually fully agree with someone, right? How many things would you have to have 100% conviction on, right? More realistically, it seems that we might have 100% conviction on plus or minus 50%, in other words, on some things, right? And we have some items at plus or minus 70% conviction where we seem to have varying levels of agreements between each other and with different positions, and even perhaps on individual claims, right? So this holds not just for, yeah, a specific claim or a specific decision, one, artificial vacuum sense of a line of reasoning or an argument, right? But also just positions broadly. If we agree with welfare or laissez-faire economics, right? Perhaps I would have some agreements on some things and not at all on other things. And to what extent do we then still maintain agreements with these positions? And is it sensible to say something along those lines, right? Okay, I need to slow down. So when we get to the extreme end of things, we can start to think about deep agreements and how they kind of look, at least in theory, right? So I use a couple of visual metaphors or analogies, right? A deep agreement for me, if you're thinking about 100% conviction on a single item, it's kind of like a fence post, right? The idea being that you have this incredibly deep agreement, you cannot pull it out, no regular amount of muscle would do it. You would need some sort of special machinery to dig down to get at it, right? I don't want to talk about the resolutions of deep agreements yet because I'm not 100% sure about how, but you get the idea, right? It's going to have differing characteristics about it than other types of deep agreements. So what I call an entrenched agreement rather than a deep agreement would be, say, holding many of those fence post length, kind of points of agreement, all these roots we might think of different that's or twos or different parts of content that could be agreed upon. Some are a little bit shorter, some are thinner, some are more stable. But the point being is that if you hold an entrenched agreement, removing a tree with its root structure is going to be a very different endeavor than trying to remove a single fence post. And one of the important parts here is that it still maintains the depth of conviction part, because unlike, say, a patch of grass, which would also have a whole lot of roots and spread out, you can kind of roll up a patch of grass relatively quickly, right? So if we think of an entrenched agreement with being an agreement with an ideology to a very deep degree, a wide agreement might just be more superficial. I use the example of planning a conference, which I think I was doing at the time when I wrote the paper, so that's why it came to mind. But if you're planning a conference and you're working with colleagues, you might agree on a location, on a date, on a time, on certain rooms, but all of those things, you could be persuaded to change your mind pretty readily. So you have a whole lot of agreements, but any given one of them or all of them could be rolled up and kind of switched away to a much easier extent. So these are how I kind of make the distinctions. And I think for ethical considerations, these two, the first two are going to be kind of most important or most prominent for our thinking. Finally, ethics. Now you know what agreements are. Everybody loves a good meme. I can't see if John's here, but I was hoping John would appreciate some of my memes. So ethics, yes, always has been, right? Some people might say, argumentation isn't about that, but our close colleague here, Katerina, has definitely demonstrated that it's all over argumentation ethics, and I think in agreements as well. So when we start to think about specifically about differing ethical considerations, if we go with the types of agreement that I've talked about already, we have ethical questions that pertain to each, right? So if we have an agreement that, right, well, do we agree that racism is good, right? Do we agree that sexism is bad, right? Is the content a part of the ethical considerations in the agreement, or are our agreements inherently neutral and we assess the content independently? Right. So in other words, can a deep agreement be unethical in itself? Right. One of the things I think about in this regard is whether we would want somebody to be only partially anti-racist, right, or anti-sexist, right? Should arguments attempt to have people deeply agree, or just agree enough that say racism is untenable, right? To use the pragmadialectical version. It's a tricky question because there's differing consequences to each, right? And I'm not sure about a full answer. Again, another question mark, I apologize, but it's another place where I think ethics and agreements and the resolution of arguments that are seeking agreement, it's a place that needs to be paid attention to. Obviously, actions, right, follow suit, right? If we agree to commit a murder, is the ethics of the joint action separate from the ethics of the agreement or how we came to it from the argumentative process? Right? Do we want to keep those as the is the process separate, right? Which I don't think it is. Same with the reasons for something, right? Working in a business school, we often talk about self-interest, right? And the benefits and consequences, positive and negative consequences of operating in self-interest, right? So if that's your reason for, right? If you have, a company and you say we should do this because it meets our interests, again, is that a separate issue from the agreement itself? Is it all content related and I'm just kind of barking up the wrong tree here, right? And here is where you get your explanation for at least your first one for the bullet point, aside from the last meme there, right? Perhaps we agree so we don't get shot, right? Then it has actually almost nothing to do with the propositional content, right? Or perhaps I agree so I don't lose my job. Somebody is holding power, right? Or I'm going to agree with you so you find me more attractive, right? So there are lots of differing, kind of contents of agreement that we would have that don't actually have to do with any kind of propositional content as well, right? So using that framework of what agreements are, taking a look at the different types, this is how I kind of can draw out some of the ethical considerations, many of which kind of revolve around the question of whether agreement is separate from the content that it's discussing, right? And finally, of course, the most complicated one is the agreement with, because of what it, can capture, right? So maybe you agree with Baumtrog or Trump, Capone, Mother Teresa, right? Or positions, communism, fascism, capitalism, democracy. I think one of two things either has to happen. Either we say there's no such expression as we agree with, or we allow that we can agree with parts of and speak generally as though we agree with the whole, which I'll come to in a bit, has more complications to it, right? But this is kind of the idea. These types of with are kind of the idea behind the tree, right? You might agree with some of those roots more inherently, but even if you take out some of the more shallow ones, you still have that basic agreement with the bigger entity, right? So Al Capone, you can get a much farther word, or you can get much farther with a kind word and a gun than you can with a kind word alone, right? And I think that that's what he was trying to express, that you can get people to agree so, even if you don't have all the other kind words, right? Okay, so more complicating ethics aside from the basic components. One of my favorite quotes comes from John Casey. Agreement, consensus, and collaboration can function as means of control, manipulation, or domination. First of all, I just really like things that come in threes, and he does it twice in one sentence, which I think is really nice. It sounds very good, but it's also incredibly astute, I think, and poignant. We tend to think of agreements as prima facie good, right? We want to come to agreements on certain things, and he kind of flips that on its head pretty vividly. So he writes, in 2016 U.S. presidential election, Russian troll farmers created millions of fake bot accounts aimed at giving people the impression that certain of their views or views they were disposed to were widely shared. What resulted, in essence, is that people became victims of their own beliefs. Agreement was turned against them. So we've been talking so far about creating agreements, how we come to them, what kind of types they can be, but I think that this raises really interesting kind of meta questions, not only about the creation, but when you have agreements, how can they be weaponized, right? How can they be used for good and for bad purposes? So ethics in the creation, ethics after the establishment, I think permeates both sides of agreement there. Along similar lines, there's a great book coming out by Katerina Stevens. On the very first page of that book, if I argue with you, chances are that it will thereby influence your beliefs, attitudes, emotions, and decisions a little or even a lot. And if you argue back, you will probably influence mine. Thereby, we can do each other a lot of good or a lot of harm. So the do each other a lot of good or a lot of harm, that for me is very clearly the ethical components here. And when I read this word influence, right, does influence mean inspire some agreement? Right? Could that be a part of it? If influence means at least in part creating a level of agreement, then it's the creation of that agreement. It's the attempt to create the agreement that can cause each other a lot of good or a lot of harm. Right? So again, I think we see our attempts to influence people, to get people to agree with us, as very ethically laden. Right? Two big questions both Casey and Stevens' work raise. When should we try to create and or seek agreements? Right. And again, I'm saying seek agreements because there are lots of other things you can do when you try to resolve a difference of opinion or a disagreement. It's context dependent. But when should we try to seek or create agreements, increase the adherence of the audience to the theses, and how deep should we try to make the agreement, right? How far should we try to increase the adherence, right? As I said, if you have 100% agreement on every possible piece of content, have you just created a duplicate person, and is that worthwhile, right? So I know for sure at least the first question is addressed in Kat's new book, and as soon as I get a chance to go through it in detail, I will be scouring for that one, and hopefully also some part about the second question there, how deep we should try to make the agreement. I'll take a look at. Okay, part two, and then this pertains, I think, mostly to the kind of agreement with as a broad category, right? So by default, I can say I think I have a policy where I agree with my wife and I agree with other people, perhaps some of my co-editors, right? So I have a really a more or less implicit or explicit policy of agreeing with them. So, according to Michael Bratman, a policy are intentions that are appropriately general in their content. They support treating over time like cases in like ways, and doing this is a matter of, and so with reference to one's policy. So, ceteris paribus, if I don't have any other overriding reasons, I would agree, say, with a person, right? If I agree with Cat Stevens, I'm pointing to a definite with as a person, but also an undefined and indefinite set of that's and twos and becauses. Some things that we've talked about, some things we likely haven't, but only some of which I may be able to point out. Either way, I think it still makes sense to say I agree with that person, right? And you can do so generally, and it makes sense. But to what extent we should or ought to distinguish all of the pieces of such a declaration of agreement with, I think can matter. So it's the same with a position. If I agree with democratic socialism, right, I might agree that we should follow principles like from each according to their ability, to each according to their need, but may also think that we should fund the military more, right? And other democratic socialists may disagree with it, right? So to what extent do I agree with them or do I disagree with them? Does it make sense to still say I agree with the ideology, right? So sorting out what components of what positions are there may or may not be that important. It's one of the questions that I'm trying to figure out. Should we abandon discussions of agreeing with things that are this broad, right? So it raises questions about our ethics of association, right? Insofar as our identity is at least partly comprised by our agreements, right? If somebody says, "Oh, who are you? What do you stand for?" and you say, "Oh, I stand for this," or "I stand for that," it's a part of who you are, and you're going to have more and less refined agreements with the propositions that compose those broader widths, right? Okay, and this kind of thinking was inspired by this clip. I've enabled my sound. I hope you can hear it.
What has been the
It starts off quiet.
or funniest or a comment that's really stuck out to you when you were doing like the man on the street interviews?
You know, one that always stands out to me is, in fact, I think my favorite comment was I was talking to a woman at the first Trump impeachment, and Trump was blocking witnesses from testifying. And he was blocking Michael Bolton from testifying, and not Michael Bolton, John Bolton. Michael Bolton could testify, you know? And what a beautiful testimony it would be. He was blocking John Bolton from testifying, among others. And I was talking to this woman, and she said, like, he's innocent. He's completely innocent. He didn't do anything wrong. If he was trying to do, if he did something wrong, he'd be trying to hide it. I was like, well, if he was stopping people from testifying, that would be an admission of guilt, right? And she said, of course, of course. And then I told her, I was like, he is blocking people from testifying. And she takes this very long beat. She thinks about it. And she says, I don't care. She was being completely honest in that moment. And she's right. Like, so much of this, we're like, oh, but maybe I could convince that person that they could care if there was that one thing. And I read something recently that said, like, you know, we can have debates about what you want. That's politics. I want this, I want that. Let's meet somewhere in the middle. That's politics. When your politics becomes who you are, we can't debate that. Real hard to change. And the Trump magic trick is that he made folks think this is who they are. They are MAGA. And so when we talk about, like, do you think he's guilty? Do you think he's not guilty? We can banter back and forth about the details. We can quibble in that way. But we're not really coming to an understanding of truth. That's who that person is, and they don't give a shit with the new piece of information. And so that moment for me was revelatory.
What has been...
Okay. Could you hear that? Good. Okay, excellent. So I thought that it was an incredibly interesting little outtake from a famous show that talks about kind of what entrenched agreements are like, how you could let go of that one branch, right? About showing contradictory evidence and simply say, I don't care, because you're still maintaining the general agreement with the rest of the roots in the tree, right? So it raises questions about what our agreements do to who we are and our identity. Can we change who we are through argumentation, right? As Katerina says, would we influence each other, and how much of a part of that influence becomes our identities? Would testing the tenability of a position or finding truth, if we don't identify it with it, improve who we are, right? If we're just always bracketing things as only a thought experiment, but it's not encompassed in our being, right? What kind of an impact would that be? And overall, do agreements and how we come to them create or change us, right? And I think that's really the heart of what ethics is. It's about who we are and how we operate. So Alanis Morissette recently got a PhD, so I wanted to put her picture up here and what it all comes down to, right? Here's my summary. In my view, argumentation can play a central role in creating agreements, right? I think that, of course, argumentation does other things as well, but this is one central role that it has. I still think there's a lot of work to be undone, or is to be done, sorry, uncovering the nature of agreements and how argumentation can improve their production, and importantly, when it should, and how far. I really honestly believe that your agreements can change who you are, right? And I for the reasons that Klepper, there we saw Jordan Klepper from The Daily Show, that he teaches us, right? It's if you have a reciprocal feedback loop between a spokesperson and an ideology and a recipient, and then you have that agreement getting stronger and stronger and stronger, it's going to change not just individual actions, but the inherent person, right? And I think we are, as people, unavoidably more or less unethical. So if our agreements are creating that, it's creating that component of us. So my advice, be careful with the agreements that you keep in addition to the company. So yeah, sorry I've asked more questions than I have provided assertions in the talk. I hope it's provided food for thought, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
So much for that. That was wonderful. Let me just